Greetings, comrades! When most people talk about Russia or when Russia is in the headlines, it is always about Moscow or the western part. When a Westerner is asked to name a city in Russia, what will he say? Moscow, St. Petersburg, maybe Kazan or Volgograd will come to mind. Indeed, most tourists primarily visit these very cities. If you say that in fact the European part of Russia occupies only 20% of the country's territory, most people will be amazed. But then they will remember, oh, that's right, you have vast uninhabited Siberia and Taiga, right? Baikal is over there somewhere. Better, but in fact Russia is not only European part plus Siberia. There is also a region the very name of which emphasizes its detachment from the main part of Russia, the Far East. The Far Eastern Federal District is the official name of this region. It is the largest region of the country. Its territory is 6,952,555 square kilometers, a little less than Australia and around 2 Indias. At the same time, only about 5% of the country's population lives there. The center of this district is the city of Vladivostok, located on the shore of the Pacific Ocean. To get to Vladivostok from Moscow by rail, you will have to travel 9,000 kilometers. In comparison, Seoul is only 750 kilometers away and Tokyo is 1,000 kilometers. Even Darwin in Australia is only 6,100 kilometers away. It would seem that an area so remote from the main settlements should be strikingly different from the rest of the country. Surely the proximity of China, Korea and Japan brings some sort of influence on life there. Surely there are differences in language and dialects, in customs and food, in culture and mentality. Maybe the population of the Far East looks different. Let's find out. In fact, residents of the Russian Far East are often met with confusion by foreigners when they say that they are from far east of Russia. But you don't look Asian, you look Slavic, European. But you have to remember that most Russians living east of Urals moved there during Soviet times, or are descendants of people who did so. There is a stereotype that the Far East is like Russia's Australia, populated by former exiled criminals in Tsarist Russia and residents of gulags in the USSR. This is also not true. Indeed, many people were exiled to this place, but believe me, those who survived these exiles did not want to stay there even for one extra second. Those who actually populated the Far East under the USSR went there quite voluntarily, at the call of their hearts or wallets. Or by distribution, if we are talking about soldiers or young specialists after universities. Accordingly, the ethnic composition of most cities in the Far East was absolutely the same as that of any other Soviet city. Yes, don't be surprised, a typical resident of Sakhalin Island looks no different from a typical resident of some Bryansk region. Of the total population of Russia, 81% of people are ethnic Russians. In the Far East, this figure is almost the same, 79%. Yes, the Far East district includes, for example, Buryatia with only 59% of Russians, and Yakutia with 33%. But first of all, the same Yakutia is considered by many to be Eastern Siberia rather than the Far East, despite the official definition. And secondly, both Buryats and Yakuts have been living side by side with ethnic Russians for quite a long time, and have assimilated very much over the centuries. So yes, in the Far East you are more likely to find groups that are of Asian origin and look Asian, that practice Buddhism or herd reindeer, but are they much more common? 2% more. And I don't recommend telling them that they are Asian-looking Russians, they might be offended. They identify themselves as Yakuts or Buryats first and foremost. And my favorite region of the Far East is, of course, the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, the only region in the world where Yiddish has the status of an official language, yet it is one of the regions with the largest percentage of ethnic Russian population in Russia. The percentage of Jews? 0.6%. As for the language, the Russian language itself is remarkably homogeneous given the number of speakers and geographical spread. In total, there are 3 main types of dialect in the Russian language: the North Russian dialect, the South Russian dialect, and the Central Russian dialects. To be honest, I can easily identify people from southern regions like Rostov or Krasnodar by the way they speak, but all the other dialects have long been mixed with each other and exist in pure form only in remote villages. Since the Far East was developed by people from all regions of European Russia, both during the Empire and the USSR, no special dialect was formed there. Of course, there are some words that are more widespread, such as the word sopka, which means something between a high hill and a low mountain with gentle slopes. On the internet you can find statements that the Far East often borrows some word from Chinese, in particular kunya, from the Chinese gunyan, girl. However, when I asked my acquaintance from Vladivostok about it, he said that I'm a blockhead and it was the first time he had heard such a word. In general, yes, an average resident of the Far East not only looks like a typical Russian, but also talks like a typical Russian. Okay, we've got the looks and language sorted out, but something must be different, right? If you ask the residents of the Far East about it, they will proudly say that they have special people. More free, more energetic, a little less spoiled by the humdrum life of big cities. After all, who has historically developed these lands? The most resilient, vigorous people who were not afraid of difficulties, who had an adventurous spirit, the ability to take risks and survive. Some of them came here in search of a better life, some of them came at the urging of the government, and some of them were simply banished, so to speak, for disobedience. We can say that historically, a unique human resource pool has been concentrated here. People with a special will to live, a proactive approach to life, and at the same time people able to work and overcome difficulties. That is why the people of the Far East have a really special character. But one should not think that there is any strong influence of neighbors here. People from the Far East of Russia don't really relate to Chinese manners or Japanese hard work. These are personality traits shaped by the difficulties of life in the Russian Far East, even in modern conditions. It is worth explaining that on average everything in the Far East costs more than in the European part of Russia. There is one reason for this – logistics. Most of the Far East is located in harsher climatic conditions, with cities and towns located farther apart. Most things have to be shipped from central parts of the country or abroad, and local production is harder to develop. For the same reasons, you have to buy components and technology somewhere, and climate and distance makes things even harder. At the same time, connections with neighboring countries are not as well established as many people think. Most logistics hubs are in the European part of the country, and I have often seen stories of how when ordering from the same AliExpress from China to Yakutsk, the goods were first delivered to Moscow and from there distributed back to the Far East. And this is not to mention the most remote regions, such as Kamchatka or Sakhalin. All these peculiarities are even more noticeable there. Kamchatka is a geographically and logistically isolated region, so the local mentality has a certain division of the world into Kamchatka and the mainland, by which they mean the rest of the world. So for them, Khabarovsk and St. Petersburg are often two equally distant cities, somewhere out there on the mainland. It is from Kamchatka that we often get those wonderful photos with prices of fresh fruits and vegetables, which can cost 2, 3, 5 times more than in other regions of the Far East, and 10 times more than somewhere in the Caucasus. Here are tomatoes at 1,250 rubles per kilogram in 2020, around $15. Or strawberries from Belarus, 3,500 rubles, $40 per kilogram. But salmon, caviar, rare Kamchatka crabs, these delicacies are more available here than anywhere else, and often cost less than the same tomatoes or strawberries. If we are talking about architecture, surprisingly, the Asian cities of Russia do not look Asian at all. In Vladivostok the architecture looks more Russian than in modern Moscow. To be honest, probably the only place in Russia that feels like real Asia is Kalmykia, and Kalmykia is located ironically in the European part of Russia. In the Far East there are quite a lot of Asian products in the supermarkets, a few more authentic Korean and Chinese restaurants, and a pretty solid population of foreign students from Asia. But it doesn't make the cities any more typically Asian. In everything except for one thing. Do you know what the most significant difference between Vladivostok and Moscow is, which catches your eye immediately? It is the number of right-hand drive cars, over 80% of them, while only 7% in Russia in total. The thing is that before the imposition of huge duties in 2008, Toyota was cheaper than Volga in Vladivostok, and I think it's obvious what the locals chose. Moreover, people from other regions, even from the European part of the country, often came to Vladivostok specifically to buy Japanese cars, and then drove 9,000 kilometers back. What other unusual for Russians things are available to the residents of the Far East? Direct flights to Asia. For example, a Vladivostok-Beijing ticket for the end of August costs 7,500 rubles. To Moscow on the same day, 17,000. Thanks to this, the majority of Far East residents have been to other countries, something that residents of many Russian regions cannot boast of. But again, Prague or Berlin, despite the 8,000 kilometers distance, will feel much more familiar to residents of the Far East than the more closed Tokyo. And by the way, speaking about peculiarities, it is worth remembering about the proximity of the sea. Russia, with all its territory, has very scarce access to the sea, if you do not count the Arctic Ocean. And here in Vladivostok you have a typical humid sea climate. And of course, the nature. I can confidently say that the Far East is the most beautiful region of Russia with its unique flora and fauna. Bears, sopkas and geysers in Kamchatka, Amur tigers, Far Eastern leopards and dense forests in Primorye, whales, sharks, dolphins, the mountain ranges of Buryatia and the icy plains of Yakutia. This is all Far East. Oh, and one more thing that definitely characterizes the people of the Far East. They can't stand Moscow. No, wait a minute, in this they are in solidarity with the inhabitants of the rest of Russia, except in fact Muscovites. In general, the Far East has historically been considered a rather protest region by the standards of modern Russia. Suffice it to recall the multi-day rallies in support of the governor of Khabarovsk Krai, Sergei Furgal. A rather surprising phenomenon. One should not forget that the Far East can be roughly divided into three parts: the southern part, the northern coast with islands, and the East Siberian part. And each part has its own specific mentality, its own socio-economic model, its own demands and needs, which the capital does not always take into account. What irritates residents of the Far East most of all is the actions of the federal center. The fact that, in their opinion, they are too rarely remembered, and they feel disconnected from the rest of Russia, especially the south of the Far East. People believe that its potential as a seaport and gateway to Asia is clearly underutilized, as well as its potential as a tourist destination. The Far East is also very rich in raw material resources. The macro region produces 98% of Russia's diamonds, 80% of tin, 90% of boron, 50% of gold, 14% of tungsten, 40% of fish and seafood. About 1/3 of the country's total coal reserves and hydroelectric resources are located there. At the same time, the residents of the region believe that they give away in the form of taxes much more than they receive back from the federal center. Outside of major cities there is hardly any infrastructure. Roads are bad, many places are inaccessible without a good off-road vehicle. Although in the last 5-7 years the local aviation system has been developing, it is still much worse than it was under the USSR. There are not many job options here, cultural life is not so diverse either, and that is why the young population is leaving. Yes, purely statistically, the average salary, pension and income of the district's population are 10 to 20% higher than the national average, but due to high prices, the standard of living in general is lower here. Everything is like everywhere else in Russia, but a little worse. In fact, this is what makes the region protest. Residents want some kind of change, namely more autonomy for themselves, less dependence on the capital, which is thousands of miles away and from which all the problems on the ground are simply not seen. Plus, we should not forget the peculiarities of the character of people in the Far East. They are used to doing everything with their own hands and being responsible for their own well-being. So when something is imposed on them from the outside, from distant Moscow, it is sometimes perceived with hostility. The Far East does not want to separate from Russia, although wild fantasies about this have been circulating on the internet for the past couple of years. The people of the Far East want simple and obvious things: infrastructure development, higher wages, and prevention of the access of qualified personnel to the European part of the country. But so far, the Far East has been losing people year after year. Yes, the government is implementing programs to develop Far Eastern cities, trying to make them an attractive place to move to. They lure people with the same things they lured them with in the Soviet times: salaries, career opportunities, and sometimes even housing. Investments are being brought in, new industrial classes are being established, railroads and highways are being built. The Far Eastern Hectare program is well known. Just apply for it and you will be given a whole hectare of land for free in any of the regions of the Far East. Do whatever you want with it. A family of 3 can already get 3 hectares, and your taxes will be reduced too. Are you surprised that the land is given away so easily? Don't be. The population density of the Far Eastern District is 1.13 people per square kilometer. For comparison, the most sparsely populated state of the contiguous United States, Wyoming, has a density twice as high. According to the government, 120,000 people have already received free plots of land since the start of the program. Don't want land, want an apartment? Far Eastern Mortgage with the annual rate of 2% instead of 20% is also tempting. Will it help stop the extinction of the region and turn it into a true Russian gateway to Asia? Well, first of all this will work only if new jobs actually appear, roads are built and wages grow. If all these fancy great projects will not remain only on paper. If all this is done, then for some more attractive regions like Khabarovsk and Primorsky Krai, sure, it will give a new impetus to their development. But will a big salary and a plot of land be enough to lure people to Yakutia, to Nizhneyansk, which looks like this, or to Oymyakon, which is famous as the coldest place on Earth after Antarctica? I'm not so sure. Thanks for watching. Well, the Euro is over, so I can get back to a more regular schedule. And as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Zakharova, Kirill Klimuk, Zeman Berza, Jimmy Albin, Petr Ilich and Bruce Eternik. See you guys next time.